In 146 BC, Roman soldiers marched through the streets of Carthage carrying torches. For 6 straight days and nights, they burned everything. Houses, temples, libraries, gardens, markets, all of it. When the smoke finally cleared, a city that had stood for nearly 700 years and held close to 500,000 people was simply gone. Not damaged, not occupied, gone. The Romans then rounded up what was left of the survivors, roughly 50,000 men, women, and children, and sold every single one of them into slavery. Then they did something almost nobody had bothered doing to a defeated enemy before. They formally cursed the ground. A Roman senator stood in the ruins and declared that nothing should ever be built or planted there again. For more than 100 years, that patch of earth stayed empty. A warning, a reminder. So how does one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the entire Mediterranean get completely erased from the map? And why did Rome hate this place so badly that simply winning was not enough? To understand that, we have to go back almost 700 years before the fires, to a stretch of beach in North Africa, where a queen on the run made a clever little deal that her descendants would one day pay for in blood. Round 814 BC, long before Rome was even a village, a Phoenician princess named Dido fled her home city of Tyre in the eastern Mediterranean. Her brother, the king, had just murdered her husband for his gold. Dido grabbed her supporters, loaded up some ships, and sailed west. Eventually, she reached a coastline in what is now Tunisia, looked around, and decided this was the place. The local Berber chief, a man named Yarbas, was not exactly thrilled about strangers showing up. But Dido was charming, and she came with treasure. She asked for a small favor. She only wanted as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. Yarbas laughed and agreed. How much trouble could that be? Dido then took the ox hide and cut it into thin strips, thinner than a fingernail, and tied them all together into one impossibly long cord. With that cord, she marked out an entire hill. Yarbas had been outsmarted by a refugee, and he knew it, but a deal was a deal. On that hill, Dido founded a city she called Carthage, meaning new city. The Romans would later twist the name into Carthago, Carthage. The trick with the ox hide turned out to be a sign of things to come. Carthage would always win by being cleverer. Within a few centuries, that little hilltop settlement had grown into the biggest, richest port city in the western Mediterranean. The secret was simple. The Carthaginians were the absolute masters of the sea. While other civilizations were busy farming and fighting over patches of dirt, the Carthaginians built ships, better ships than anyone else. Their merchants sailed everywhere, North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, even as far as Britain looking for tin, and possibly all the way down the west coast of Africa. They traded silver, gold, ivory, purple dye, glass, wine, and grain in quantities nobody else could match. Their harbor was a marvel of engineering. A massive circular inner port could hold more than 200 warships at once, hidden from view, so visitors had no idea how powerful the Carthaginian fleet actually was. The outer harbor handled merchant traffic from across the known world. The city itself had triple walls nearly 13 meters high, so thick that defenders could march elephants along the top. Inside lived close to 500,000 people, which made Carthage one of the largest cities on earth at the time. They worshipped gods with names like Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, spoke a language called Punic, and answered to a council of wealthy merchants rather than a king. And then, across the sea, a small village on 7 hills started growing. Rome started as nothing special. A cluster of mud brick huts on the Italian peninsula, founded according to legend in 753 BC by a guy named Romulus, who allegedly killed his own twin brother in an argument over a wall. For its first few centuries, Rome was barely worth noticing. It fought its neighbors, slowly absorbed them, and built up an army of tough farmer soldiers who were famous for one thing: they did not quit. By around 270 BC, Rome had finally managed to conquer the entire Italian peninsula. For the first time, the Romans looked across a narrow stretch of water and saw the island of Sicily. And on Sicily, they saw Carthaginian outposts. The two civilizations could not have been more different. Rome was a land power built on farmers and infantry. Carthage was a sea power built on merchants and mercenaries. Rome was run by a senate of aristocratic families obsessed with honor and military glory. Carthage was run by businessmen who preferred to solve problems with money. Up to this point, the two had actually been on friendly terms. They had signed treaties. They had traded goods. Roman senators had even visited Carthage and come back impressed. But in 264 BC, a small dispute over a city in Sicily called Messina lit a fuse that nobody could put out. The First Punic War, named after the Roman word for Carthaginian, Punicus, lasted 23 brutal years, and it should have been a complete walkover for Carthage. The Carthaginians had the most experienced navy on earth. The Romans had almost no navy at all. They were farmers and infantry. They did not even know how to build a warship, so they did something almost unbelievable. According to the ancient historians, a Carthaginian warship ran aground on the Italian coast during a storm. The Romans dragged it out of the surf, took it apart piece by piece, and used it as a blueprint. Within about 2 months, they had built 100 copies. Then they trained crews to row them by making them practice on dry land, sitting on benches in the sand, pulling imaginary oars. It sounds ridiculous. It worked. The Romans also invented a clever device called the corvus, basically a giant spiked boarding ramp. When a Roman ship pulled alongside an enemy vessel, the corvus would slam down and lock the two ships together. Suddenly, instead of a naval battle, it became a land battle on water, and nobody beat Roman legionaries in a land battle. Carthage was stunned. They started losing battles at sea, battles they had no business losing. And one young Carthaginian general was paying very close attention. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and by the end of the First Punic War in 241 BC, Carthage had been forced into a humiliating peace. They had to hand over Sicily, pay a massive war indemnity, and watch Rome strut around like the new power in the Mediterranean. Hamilcar was furious. He believed Carthage had lost only because the merchant council back home was too cheap to fund the war properly. So he took his family and sailed to Spain, where Carthage still had silver mines and territory, determined to build a new empire there and one day finish what the First War had started. Before he left, he made his 9-year-old son swear an oath at the altar. The boy placed his hand on the sacrificial offering and promised his father that he would be a lifelong enemy of Rome. That little boy's name was Hannibal. Hamilcar spent the rest of his life expanding Carthaginian power across Spain, and he raised Hannibal in army camps, teaching him strategy, languages, and how to lead men. When Hamilcar died, his son-in-law took over. When the son-in-law was assassinated, the soldiers themselves chose Hannibal as their new commander. He was 26 years old. He spoke at least 4 languages. He had been waiting for this moment his entire life, and Rome had no idea what was coming. In 218 BC, Hannibal did something so insane that Roman generals literally refused to believe the reports. He left Spain with around 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, and he marched north. The Romans assumed he would come by sea, the way any sane commander would. Instead, Hannibal headed for the Alps in late autumn, with elephants. The crossing was a nightmare. Freezing storms, narrow mountain paths, hostile tribes throwing rocks down from the cliffs above. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep. Elephants slipped off ledges. By the time Hannibal staggered down into northern Italy, about 15 days later, he had lost nearly half his army. But he was in Italy, and the Romans had no army between him and Rome itself. What followed was 3 of the most lopsided military disasters in Roman history. At the Trebia River, Hannibal tricked a Roman army into crossing freezing water before battle and slaughtered them. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed another Roman army in heavy fog along a narrow lakeshore and killed 15,000 men in a few hours. Then in 216 BC, at a dusty plain called Cannae, he pulled off the deadliest single day in Roman history. He let the Roman center push forward, wrapped his wings around them, and trapped 80,000 legionaries inside a closing ring of steel. Around 50,000 Romans died at Cannae in a single afternoon. To put that in perspective, that is more soldiers killed in one day than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. Roman senators walked through the streets in mourning. Women wailed in public. Some Romans started whispering about surrender. But Rome did something almost no other ancient state would have done. They refused. They raised new legions, even arming slaves and teenagers. They forbade public mourning beyond 30 days because it was bad for morale. and they adopted a new strategy devised by a careful general named Fabius Maximus. Never fight Hannibal in a pitched battle again. Just shadow him, cut off his supplies, wear him down. Years passed. Hannibal roamed up and down Italy, winning battle after battle, but he could not crack Rome itself. He had no siege equipment heavy enough for those walls, and the merchant council back in Carthage refused to send him reinforcements. They were still being cheap. Meanwhile, a young Roman general named Scipio took the war to Spain, captured the Carthaginian strongholds there, and then did something bold. In 204 BC, he sailed for Africa with an army. He was going to attack Carthage itself. Carthage panicked and called Hannibal home. After 15 years in Italy, the greatest general of the age was forced to retreat. In 202 BC, the two men finally met on a battlefield called Zama in North Africa. According to the historians, they actually spoke face to face before the battle, two of the greatest commanders in history standing alone between their armies, trying one last time to find a peaceful way out. They could not. Scipio had learned from Hannibal's own playbook. He had trained his cavalry, recruited Numidian horsemen who used to fight for Carthage, and copied Hannibal's tactics back at him. When the battle began, Hannibal's war elephants charged. Scipio's men opened gaps in their lines and let the elephants run harmlessly through. Then the Roman cavalry crushed the Carthaginian flanks, looped around behind, and trapped Hannibal's army exactly the way Hannibal had trapped the Romans at Cannae. It was over. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage broken. They lost their navy, their overseas territories, and were forced to pay another enormous war indemnity for 50 years. They were forbidden from making war on anyone without Rome's permission. Hannibal escaped and lived as a fugitive for years, advising kings who dared to defy Rome before finally taking poison rather than be captured. And here is the strangest part of the whole story. Carthage, even after losing 2 wars and most of its empire, slowly started to recover. Its harbor filled with ships again, its markets buzzed, and that recovery is exactly what doomed them. In Rome, an old senator named Cato the Elder visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission around 153 BC and came back horrified by how rich the city looked. From that day on, no matter what speech he gave in the Senate, no matter the topic, taxes, roads, anything, he ended with the same line. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it for years. Eventually, enough senators agreed. In 149 BC, Rome found a flimsy excuse and demanded Carthage hand over its weapons, then its hostages, and finally that the entire city be abandoned and rebuilt inland away from the sea. That last demand was impossible, and Rome knew it. Carthage chose to fight one final hopeless war. For 3 years, the people of Carthage held out behind their massive walls, melting down statues for weapons, women cutting their hair to make bowstrings. In 146 BC, the Romans finally broke in, and the 6 days of burning began. The city that had taught Rome how to build a navy, that had nearly destroyed Rome at Cannae, that had stood for almost 700 years, was wiped from the map. If this story grabbed you, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Drop a comment telling me which ancient empire you want to hear about next.